After getting the 53-man roster set yesterday, the Chicago Bears made the moves after the big moves, shaking some things up with Teven Jenkins to injured reserve, a new punt returner coming in, and a couple of young players claimed on waivers.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $5 on your bet to get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. On the show today, we check in on the second wave of roster moves after the initial 53-man roster was set, including Tevin Jenkins moving to injured reserve, what that means for the offensive line in the immediate term and also the sort of short term for when Tevin Jenkins gets back with this group up front. Then we'll learn more about the Bears' new punt returner, Trent Taylor, and what his arrival means for Velus Jones and Tyler Scott. And then we'll wrap up looking at the two players the Bears claimed on waivers initially, Khalid, Kareem, and Quindell Johnson, both younger players with some real upside here that clearly the Bears valued and wanted to make sure they had a chance to take a longer look at on the 53-man roster. But I think the bigger transaction in terms of impact here right away is Teven Jenkins going on injured reserve. It was something we had speculated as a possibility going into the 53-man roster deadline. But of course, the way this had to work is you had to keep Teven Jenkins on your initial 53-man roster in order for him to then be able to go on short-term injured reserve. Any player placed on injured reserve before that deadline on Tuesday is out for the season automatically. The likes of Dante Pettis placed on injured reserve ahead of time, so there's no designating him for return and bringing him back after just a handful of weeks. Jenkins, because he was on the initial 53, is now eligible to be designated to return, which is kind of a convoluted way of saying he's going to miss a minimum of 4 weeks, and then the Bears can start bringing him back at any point after the first 4 weeks of the season. So we know weeks 1 through 4 will be without Teven Jenkins on this Chicago Bears offensive line. The injury itself, still a little bit of a mystery. Ryan Poles declined to get into specifics of what it is that Teven Jenkins is dealing with. Just kind of called him week to week and made the announcement that injured reserve was indeed coming for him. And so as we look at like life without Jenkins for now on the offensive line, we know Cody Whitehair for now is moving to left guard as he deals with a hand injury that keeps him from being able to snap the ball. Lucas Patrick has been back at practice, and he is the first team starting center. They've also had the new offensive lineman that they traded for from the Miami Dolphins, Dan Feeney, has been working on snapping the ball. And so it feels like at this point, he's your go-to backup center if anything happens, but he may also be your go-to backup left guard. You know, Ja'Tyre Carter is still under contract. He's played the entire preseason and his whole career really at right guard. Certainly they could plug him into left guard if they needed to, but I would imagine Feeney might be your first choice backup left guard and Carter would be your first choice backup right guard, and then Feeney can still be backup center, but Doug Kramer is in there as well, so that, you know, if you happen to be in a situation with multiple offensive line injuries, you know, you could move Feeney over to guard, bring Kramer into center, and still feel like, you know, you've got a few different options there for that group up front on the offensive line. It's kind of the latest in a struggle of injury sagas for Tevin Jenkins. We talked about that a little bit when the injury first happened there, but we've seen, throughout the course of his career, just now his third season, he has not been able to stay healthy for not even just a full 17 games, but more than 13 games in a season. Played 13 games last year, 6 the year before that, all with injuries at different positions, right? Of different body parts and also positions on the offensive line, where it's not like, okay, it's the same knee or the same shoulder or the same part that's giving him problems over and over again, right? It's different things kind of bouncing around, and it becomes harder and harder to trust his long-term durability. But hopefully, 4 weeks on injured reserve is enough time to get him back to 100%. And then hopefully you can get him for the remaining 13 games of this season. And if you can kind of finish that out with some good health, maybe that's a way to sort of turn the corner here. But, if he starts to deal with more injuries down the line this season, once he's recovered from this, yeah, man, it becomes that much more troublesome for his long-term future. The move for him on injured reserve freed up a roster spot as part of the sort of cut downs and then adding players on waivers and adding free agents. And I think the way to look at this, right, transaction-wise is, okay, the Bears cut Terrell Lewis at defensive end, but then claimed at defensive end Khalid Kareem from the Indianapolis Colts. So that's kind of a one-to-one transaction. The Bears released A.J. Thomas at safety, but claimed the rookie safety Quindell Johnson off waivers from the Los Angeles Rams. So that's kind of a one-to-one cut. So then the other roster move then becomes Teven Jenkins on injured reserve and the addition of wide receiver, but more so punt returner, Trent Taylor, coming over as sort of like that roster space within this 53, right? Like the Jenkins injured reserve freed up the ability for him, spent last season with the Cincinnati Bengals, started his career with the San Francisco 49ers. And then I imagine that once Tevin Jenkins comes off of injured reserve after a minimum of 4 weeks, that they'll then have to find another roster spot for him. And I would imagine it's probably then Doug Kramer who gets the axe and would then go back to the practice squad. That Kramer makes the roster right now, perhaps only because Tevin Jenkins is on injured reserve, but with the addition of Dan Feeney plus Lucas Patrick being able to play guard or center, Feeney able to play guard or center, Kramer becomes a little bit extra he's already a little bit extra, but becomes even more extra once Tevin Jenkins is back. And I would imagine Jenkins' health will be Kramer's trip back to the practice squad, barring some other injury from some other players on the offensive line. We'll keep our fingers crossed there. This offensive line has seen plenty of injuries already, and I think they're due for some good health moving forward here from Tevin Jenkins and really everyone else. Trent Taylor, though, is a really intriguing add as a special teams ace and someone with some familiarity with this coaching staff, but also someone who can be a real upgrade at that position that leaves some question marks about Velus Jones, who is still under contract, remaining on the roster, but doesn't feel like he really has that much of a role at this point in the process. We'll check in on what Trent Taylor brings, plus what that means for the likes of Velus Jones and even the rookie Tyler Scott next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet the $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. It's a great combination of deals for new customers at FanDuel. It's why now is the best time to join. Their app is easy to use, and you can bet on everything from spreads to player props and so much more. They got a bunch of different ways you can bet on the Bears. You can bet on receiving touchdowns for DJ Moore, rushing touchdowns and passing touchdowns for Justin Fields. They've got Bears-specific props, team props, and so much more across the rest of this NFL season. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. When the Bears announced that they signed veteran kick returner Trent Taylor, we all started wondering if that would mean the end of Velus Jones, right? The initial 53-man roster comes out. Velus Jones makes the team, and it's like, all right, they're going to keep giving him another shot. They're going to stay patient. He's going to be the return man again this year. But then Trent Taylor gets signed, and we're waiting for a corresponding roster move at the time. It's like, oh, maybe this is it. Maybe Trent Taylor is the upgrade they were looking for at that spot, and that, they weren't going to cut Velus Jones perhaps until they had that type of a suitable replacement in the building. But then now once they got that under contract, because he wasn't a waiver claim, so the Bears weren't guaranteed access to Trent Taylor. He's experienced enough in the NFL that he was just outright released and was free to sign with whatever team he wanted to sign with, and the Chicago Bears were able to land him as a result. So they couldn't just say, okay, we can cut Velus because we know we have the first of the waiver claim and we'll for sure get our guy. But you thought maybe once Taylor was under contracted in the building, if Velus could be the one to get the axe. As we mentioned, Tevin Jenkins was injured reserve, was ultimately what kind of indirectly or somewhat directly then freed up the roster space for Trent Taylor. Certainly they could have found one somewhere else if they needed to, but they're holding on to Velus Jones and also bringing in Trent Taylor. And that's what I think makes this pretty interesting for me, is like how they want to handle this for Velus Jones, because I don't know what then his role ends up being, because we heard Ryan Poles talk at his press conference on Wednesday just kind of about what value they see in Trent Taylor and what that looks like for this Bears special teams. And it sounds like Taylor's going to be for sure their go-to punt returner, which was going to be one of Velus Jones's jobs. It sounds like Velus will remain the kickoff return guy, but Tyler Scott looked pretty darn good at that in the preseason himself. So it just feels to me like we're still kind of wondering how much value Velus Jones actually provides to this Chicago Bears team. But first, I want to play some of Ryan Poles' comments about Trent Taylor, because I think the way that Poles talked about Trent Taylor at his press conference really felt like striking. And he wasn't talking about Velus Jones at all, but the way he sort of describes Trent Taylor feels like a contrast to perhaps the way that they talked about or felt about Velus Jones throughout this process. To me, it was just a little bit interesting, like I don't want to say like the brashness or the boldness, but just kind of the confidence, the instant confidence that they seem to have in Trent Taylor compared to what we kind of think about with Velus Jones. What felt like a striking message of like, hey, Velus, this is kind of why, or not just kind of, this is why we signed this guy and are going with him instead of you.
Yeah, consistency. That's the biggest thing. When the ball gets punted, you can go grab a snack and go to the bathroom and then come back and you feel confident about it. So that's a big part.
With Velus in there,
he's
though.
The punt returner then. Yeah, he comes in, he's the punt returner. Yep. That's it.
Does that mean Velus is out of that competition for punt return?
No, we're going to continue. Like I said, we're going to continue to work on those guys and get them experience and try to get that confidence back that he had in college and before. So, having some of the issues that he's had, like that's a tough thing. You got to work back through it. And he's had some weird looks too. So we still believe in him, and we want to continue to develop Tyler as well.
So when the answer about why you signed a punt returner is like, or why you signed this guy in particular is like, oh, so we don't have to worry about it. It kind of indicates a little bit of like, yeah, we were tired of worrying about it. Like, oh yeah, before when there was a punt, we had to pay attention to it and be concerned. But now after we sign this guy, oh, you can go to the bathroom, get a snack. Whenever there's a punt, we don't have to worry about it. Like he didn't say the words anymore. He just said we don't have to worry about it when he's on the field, but that sort of implies we signed him so that we don't have to worry about it. And then the unspoken thing is like, because we used to have to worry about it with the last guy that we had doing it. You know what I mean? Like that's why it felt like, not like calling out Velus Jones, because they've been very upfront and honest about like, yeah, Velus Jones gets better. He kept using the phrase like, we've got to get Velus's confidence back in that area, which is a good, honest admission, but like still it's kind of confirming like, yeah, his confidence there is a big part of the problem. But at the same time, we do understand Velus Jones has great speed. He's explosive. He can make guys miss. He's got decent size as well. Like he is still dangerous when the ball is in his hands. It's just getting it in his hands and keeping it in his hands has been the real challenge there, particularly in the punting game. I think kickoff is a little bit easier. You get more of a general idea of where the ball is going to go. You have a lot more there's never going to be a defender who's about to hit you when you're catching a kickoff. There's not that immediate pressure of catching it, and you have a lot more running room after you caught the ball to sort of read the blocks and the coverage and make a play from there. Kickoff return tends to be easier in that regard than punt return. I don't want to say universally easy because each thing has its own set of challenges, but Velus Jones in particular seems to be better suited and more comfortable as a kickoff return guy. And I imagine, you get him some returns there. Maybe he breaks a couple big ones there and you keep practicing the punt side, and maybe over time you can implement him back into the punt game. But Trent Taylor is a really good punt returner, was a great punt returner for the 49ers when Bears special teams coach Richard Hightower was their special teams coordinator. Ryan Poles said that was a big reason why they signed him, that familiarity there. But Taylor was pretty solid with the Cincinnati Bengals the last couple of seasons as well. Last year averaged over 10 yards per punt return. In San Francisco, he was up over 12 yards per punt return one season. He's explosive too. He's got great short area quickness, and he's a small, speedy guy. He's never been a big-time contributor at wide receiver, but he's definitely a above-average punt returner in that regard. And so, it's not like Trent Taylor's just going to, give up reps to Velus Jones, right? I don't think we anticipate Velus Jones, quote-unquote, beating Trent Taylor in a punt return competition over the course of the season. So it would seem to me the rest of the season, as long as Trent Taylor is healthy, he should be the guy. Unless he loses confidence all of a sudden and starts blowing it as a punt returner. But for the most part, you signed him thinking he's got the role locked down for the next 17 weeks. And it's going to be next year when Velus Jones maybe gets back in punt return. But it still feels like Tyler Scott could handle the kickoff returns, or Khalil Herbert could handle the kickoff returns. And if you already got Trent Taylor under contract, then what is Velus Jones still doing here? I totally understand wanting to keep developing and not give up just yet. Give him this season and see how it goes, and then make a decision next year. But for now, it feel like it would be a little early to just totally give up on him. But he hasn't given us a ton of reason to feel like things are going to get better just yet. But there's still hope, and I think the Bears are going to be still patient for this season, and then from there we'll figure it out. But for sure, we can, much like Ryan Poles, we can stop worrying every time there's a punt when Trent Taylor is back there to catch it, because I think he should be a pretty solid option for this team on the back end of the punt return game. Not the only transaction the Bears made, though, to change up their 53-man roster, swapping out young defensive ends with Terrell Lewis gone, Khalid Kareem coming in, and then swapping out young safeties with A.J. Thomas waived and Quindell Johnson coming in. We'll get to know those two new Chicago Bears players and maybe check in on a couple of old faces that just left the Bears that have now found homes on new teams. Next on Locked On Bears. The Chicago Bears' initial 53-man roster looked like Terrell Lewis made the team. A strong preseason, a guy who, beat out Travis Gibson for his roster spot, among other people. And it was okay, great. He came in late last year as a practice squad guy and really worked hard and seemed to fit well in this defense, and ultimately, grew into a role throughout the preseason. And he's on the team until, they like their option better with somebody like Khalid Kareem. And I'm not actually sure if it's more like a Khalid or a Khalid, but I'm pretty sure it's more of a Khalid at this point. He was a 5th-round pick by the Cincinnati Bengals, actually, back in 2020. Spent the first couple of seasons of his careers with them, but dealt with injuries that kind of limited him from, I think that's sort of the view, is limited him from reaching his full potential. He still played a decent number of games his rookie season, but I believe he missed a lot of training camp that season. He was on the active non-football injury list and then wasn't activated until late August of that first rookie season. That was the COVID year as well. So from late July to late August, he missed most of the preseason and barely played. So then it was kind of a slow ramp up for him throughout that first initial regular season. Got a sack that year, but that was about it because he was still kind of catching up and learning how to play. Year 2 then goes on injured reserve right before the start of the regular season. Activated about halfway through that season, played in 7 games, but again, kind of slow out of the gate because he was injured and wasn't in practice and developing in all that time. Year 3, last year, 2022, again, injured reserve at the start of the season with a hamstring injury, misses the first half of the season again, and ends up getting waived after he comes back from injured reserve, starts on the practice squad. Colts claim on the practice squad, and he finishes the rest of that season with Indianapolis and plays a couple of games. But we really haven't seen that much of Khalid Kareem over the course of his career since he was drafted out of Notre Dame. The Bears saw him in joint practices and also saw him in the actual preseason game that he played against him. He had a really strong preseason evidently performed pretty well in those joint practices. And they saw, they also get to see then how he practices, not just game tape, but also practice tape can kind of go a long way in that regard. He had sacks in each of the 3 preseason games, the number of quarterback hurries in there as well. And one of the main things that Bears assistant general manager Ian Cunningham talked about in the press conference was like they went with Kareem over Terrell Lewis because they thought Lewis had good upside as a pass rusher, but maybe wasn't showing them as much in the running game. And Kareem is a little bit more well-rounded in that regard. Definitely stronger against the run while still having some pass rush upside, even if he hasn't had regular season production. Terrell Lewis hasn't either. So it's not like Terrell Lewis is some proven thing that they're going with some unknown guy. They both had strong preseasons. They like Kareem a little bit more, and I think Terrell Lewis will easily clear waivers and likely land on the practice squad and be easy to call back up at some point if you'd like him to. But you can take a look at Kareem for a few weeks, see how that goes, and see if he's something that maybe you can cash in on there if he can stay healthy, which he's been able to do so far through this process. And in the meantime, as he gets up to speed in this defensive stuff, you got 4 defensive ends ahead of him on that depth chart. Right? We kind of knew that was going to be maybe a spot that's going to be inactive on game days as well, with Walker and Ngakoue and Robinson and Green really handling the majority of the snaps there. And when Kareem can get in there, great. But anything he contributes this season is going to be a little bit more of a bonus. Same thing is true for the new safety. Rookie Quindell Johnson out of Memphis was an undrafted rookie free agent this season, signed by the Los Angeles Rams, 3-4 months ago, whenever the draft month, we're about to, we're turning over in September, so I don't know how you want to count 3 or 4 months ago. But regardless, he has never played an NFL game before. All the Bears were relying on there, I guess, was preseason tape, of course, and then what they saw from him in college. And that was, I think, a big part of this for Chicago. Again, we heard assistant general manager Ian Cunningham at the press conference with Ryan Poles. He said they really wanted Quindell Johnson as an undrafted rookie free agent. They tried to sign him, could not. Ultimately, for whatever reason, he chose the Rams instead of them. I don't know why. Everyone knew the Rams would be kind of a mess anyway, but there's a lot more reasons than just how good the team is for why an undrafted player might sign with the team. Playing time, maybe proximity to family or other things. Certainly dollar amount. Maybe the Rams were offering a bigger signing bonus. There's a lot of other factors that go into that. But Quindell's a really interesting, intriguing young player because he can play free safety. He can play strong safety. He can cover in the slot. He can kind of slide into more of a linebacker role. He is definitely a versatile guy with good coverage instincts. Smart player, sees the field really, really well. Now, he's not like a dynamic athlete at safety. He ran in the 4.6s, I think, at the 40-yard dash, and he's not super, super fluid. So he's not a guy that you want to match up one-on-one with a really speedy wide receiver, right? There's a reason he's more of a safety than a corner is a big part of that. But then also, I think because he's kind of, a stiff, just not a natural flowing athlete, his other big flaw is that, he misses a ton of tackles. I mean, it's not even he's not, he gets in good position or whatever, but it's not always good form, and sometimes the angles are a little bit iffy. It's he can see the play and he knows where he's supposed to go. It's just finishing it with solid tackling sometimes has been a challenge for him. But generated a lot of turnovers in college. I think he had at least 1 in the preseason so far, but that's forced fumbles and interceptions. Pass breakups can be a hard hitter. There's a lot to like about him as a guy that's worth developing. And I'm really surprised the Rams didn't keep him on the 53-man roster because, yes, they've used a bunch of draft picks on safeties in the last couple of seasons, but still, I don't think the Rams are going to be playing for a ton this year, so why not? But they kept 5 other safeties. I get it, and they were really hoping to get him on their practice squad. But I think for the Bears, again, take a chance on him, see what he can do for a couple weeks, because A.J. Thomas, who they cut, is going to easily make the practice squad. You're not going to see another team come out and try and claim A.J. Thomas. So, if you try out Quindell Johnson for a few weeks, who, by the way, good special teams player through preseason so far, and you kind of feel okay, we gave him a chance, but not quite what we thought he would be, you can cut him, bring A.J. Thomas back, and it's really no harm, no foul in that regard. So I think it's worthwhile to try and develop him and see what you might be able to get, because hopefully, fingers crossed, Eddie Jackson and Jaquan Brisker play all season, and you wouldn't need to play either of your backup safeties, but certainly Elijah Hicks is going to be your first safety off the bench in that situation. So you feel like you got options there, but he's intriguing enough with some good versatility, some good tools, good skill set that, give him a shot, especially a guy that you wanted to give a shot earlier in this process anyway, and now you got your second chance to kind of see what he can do, having him in the building and up close and personal. And again, very low stakes to replace either him or Khalid Kareem with the guys that just cut who should still then be available. I mean, that's what happens with bottom of the roster guys. They end up still being available no matter where they end up landing. Speaking of landing spots, real quick, just a quick update on other Bears players who left. Travis Gibson and Quindell Vildor both ended up with the Tennessee Titans, who, of course, the Bears played in the first preseason game, so they got to see them play both. I think both guys played pretty well against them up close and personal in person. It's a pretty deep Tennessee Titans front seven, and back in that like 3-4 scheme that I think will be a better fit for Travis Gibson at this point. The Bears kind of said as much, that the scheme fit was part of the problem there, and I think Quindell Vildor can make some noise in that cornerback room as well. Like, they've got pretty established starters there, but Vildor, good special teams player, good veteran off the bench. The thing that was maybe more surprising was that P.J. Walker landed on the practice squad of the Cleveland Browns, along with Alex Leatherwood. Less of a surprise there, but I'm really surprised that P.J. Walker, wasn't put on another team's 53-man roster, but then also, B, the Bears didn't want him on their practice squad, or he didn't want to go. For some reason, either he didn't want to come to the Bears practice squad, or the Bears didn't want him on their practice squad, but one way or another, he decided his best opportunity was going to be with another team, and a team in Cleveland that has Deshaun Watson and a rookie fifth-round pick behind him. So, I can see where maybe he feels like there's an opportunity there. The Bears say they want to bring back Nathan Peterman either on the 53 or most likely the practice squad for now, so he's going to be the number 3 quarterback, but why not P.J. Walker? At that point, I'd love to know whose decision that was for P.J. to not come back to the Bears practice squad and to instead go to Cleveland. I would guess maybe it's P.J.'s, but we don't know. Not going to speculate too strongly about that. So some interesting moves here for the Bears as they sort of readjust their 53-man roster. In theory, things should be mostly set now for week 1. There's still time for things to tweak here and there. If now everybody that got claimed, now teams are going to waive more players to replace the players they just added, and maybe the Bears could claim those players who are waived in the sort of the ripple effect of waivers that could still change this roster. But for the most part, I think we're probably pretty set throughout this stage of the process. So all of a sudden, we're going to start turning our attention to the Green Bay Packers and week 1 very, very soon, and setting some expectations for this Bears regular season. There's some other things we learned from Brian Poles and Ian Cunningham in the press conference yesterday that I still want to get to here throughout the end of the weekend into next week on the Locked On Bears podcast. So you got to check that out. Make sure you come back, keep listening each and every day. So that means hitting the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. We appreciate everyone who makes Locked On Bears your first listen each and every day. It's the everydayers that are really the diehards that are locked in. We love you guys absolutely the most, but we love you even if this is your first time tuning in or it's your 1,000th time tuning in. You are what makes this Locked On podcast go. Otherwise, I would just be sitting here talking to myself. So this is for you, and this is about you. So I appreciate you tuning in, being a part of the conversation, and I hope then in exchange, you're left with another opportunity to bear down.